So how good is the Canon R5 autofocus system? The capabilities of the R5 as a standard camera have been quite impressive so far. The camera is capable of 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter and up to 12 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode. Then we have the new autofocus system with 1053 full sensor phase detection points and up to 8 stops of image stabilisation with certain lenses. I've been using the R5 as my primary camera for well over a year now, and for the most part it's been better than expected, but also a new learning curve, especially getting to grips with the new autofocus system and the eye tracking system and the 45 megapixel files. I've managed to use the autofocus system quite a lot in the last year, but my time spent at the recent Dubai Sevens tournament really put it through its paces. I'd admit, not the easiest sport to photograph, but with the insane accuracy of the Canon focus system, I was able to lock onto my subjects and maintain focus for far longer, which in turn meant a huge improvement in hit rate of my photos. Photographing the rugby was a huge test for both speed and accuracy of Canon's new mirrorless range of cameras. In this video, I'd like to share some of the results of how the autofocus and eye tracking performed on the R5 when using the new RF400 f2.8 lens. There are some really good examples of how the autofocus tracking locks onto the subject. Sometimes it will drift away from the subject and then lock back on, or alternatively lock onto another face or eye. But on the whole, I was pretty impressed with it and I was pretty satisfied with the results. So let's see how it performed. Before we start to analyse the performance of the autofocus, it's worth noting the settings that I was using. I was in flexible priority mode using a previously configured custom shooting mode. I had the stabilisation turned on, the AF method was set to tracking with eye detection turned on, the AF operation was set to servo mode, I had C-RAW and JPEG-L set to record to 2 separate cards, the drive mode was set to high speed continuous plus, and the shutter mode was set to electronic. So just scrolling through the main menu system on the Canon R5, and you can see that the subject to detect was set to people, eye detection was enabled, and continuous AF was actually disabled. It doesn't actually need to be on. So the servo AF, I was using case A, tracking automatically adapts to subject movements, so that was set to auto. So that's obviously quite important to bear in mind. So these are some of the very early shots that I took, and as you can see that the focal point is kind of drifting around a little bit. It isn't quite latching on to the subject, well, not latching on to the moving subject, which is what it's supposed to do. So the autofocusing and the eye detection tracking was beginning to improve as the day went along. I'm beginning to notice that there was a huge improvements. With the auto mode selected in servo AF, it does state in the camera that it automatically adjusts tracking sensitivity and the acceleration and deacceleration tracking in response to changes in the subject movement. So this is all built into the auto settings of the servo AF. Early photos, you can really see that the focal point is kind of drifting, isn't quite latching on. Here you can start to see that it's really beginning to improve. Bearing in mind that there is a lot going on within these scenes. There's a lot of objects, a lot of subjects moving around, so it's very difficult for the camera to know exactly where you want the focal point to be. You can't just take it for granted that the camera is going to perform exactly the way you want it to. But you can see here, even with so many bodies in shot, the camera managed to latch on to the player's eye. So this is some of the action recorded in real time, so you can appreciate how quickly the players are moving, how fast and accurate the focusing has to be in order to keep up. Here's another really good example of how accurate the focusing was. It really latched onto this player's eye, even with the player in front of him. And as the players were moving, the focal point was drifting slightly, then it managed to latch back on again and managed to freeze the action. So pretty pleased with that. So another example here of how the autofocusing was really struggling a little bit. So you can see here there's 4 people in this scene and the autofocusing latches onto the referee's face in the background. Then it kind of readjusts and it knows that the main subject is this guy in the foreground and he's running through to score a try, and the focusing really kept up with him. So really good example here of a player who's really unobstructed. So there's nothing else in the scene, so there's no reason for the autofocus to drift off. It's only when players move across, you're kind of expecting the autofocus point to follow and track one of those players, and it just didn't. It stuck with the player who was kicking the ball. So quite impressed with that, actually. And here, just going back to some of the real-time action I recorded, and you really have to appreciate how quickly the camera and the lens and the focusing system actually has to work to keep up with the action. I think with so many subjects within the scene and the pace of the action so quick, it's unrealistic to expect a particularly high hit rate. Another really good example here of how the autofocus really latched onto a subject. But then as other players begin to enter the scene, then the focal point starts to drift slightly. You know, it obviously doesn't know what to focus on. And then another example here of how the focal point was tracking the subject, tracking the moving subject, and was actually doing quite a good job, but because there's so many people within the scene, it's difficult for the focusing system to actually know exactly what to focus on. And here, just another example of a single person within the scene, and no problem here for the autofocusing literally latching onto its subject. And just going back to some real-time action here, you can see how quick and precise and accurate the focusing is. So we're going to look at this part in a little bit more detail. We're going to slow it down a little bit. So you can see here there's 4 other players within the scene. So at times the focal point does drift off the main subject, but then it literally locks back on again. I think it did quite a good job here, actually. So the beginning of the second day, I started to see sort of like an improvement in the accuracy of the autofocusing. The hit rate was, well, it just seemed to be, an improvement on the previous day. Maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe it was just I had a different angle. I was kind of more side on to the action instead of behind one of the goals. So that could have been the reason. But I just sort of noticed possibly the focusing just seemed a little bit more sticky. I was still using the auto. I was still in auto mode, case A. The camera states that case A automatically adjusts tracking sensitivity and acceleration, deacceleration, and tracking in response to changes in subject movement. So I don't know if maybe the camera was beginning to learn. There was some kind of deep learning artificial intelligence built into the camera. Maybe the autofocusing, the more you use it, the more it's beginning to identify faces and eyes more accurately. Maybe that's the case, I don't know. Maybe Canon has something in there that we don't know about. But it just seemed to me like the camera was just, or the focusing system of the camera was kind of performing better than the previous day, and I pretty much used it for the full day. Maybe it's just my imagination, maybe I just had a better angle and it was just easier to capture the action. Like, here's a really good example of how focusing kind of latched onto the face. There's 3 other people within the scene. There's also a ball, the rugby ball's in front of his face as well. Focusing system just sort of stayed onto his face. And here, the guy kicking the ball, but he's only one in shot, so that's kind of an easy one for the focusing system to detect. So I think that kind of wraps it up. Hopefully that's been of some use and benefit, especially if you're out there and you're using the DSLRs still, which are still an amazing piece of kit, obviously tried and tested. But the new range of cameras, I think maybe there's still a lot of people who are a little bit tentative about making the jump and making the investment up to maybe the R3 or the R5 or even the R6 camera. I mean, that's got the same focusing system as the R5. The R3 obviously stands out because it's got the eye focusing functionality built in, so that's a little bit different. But in the R5, you've got the benefit of the 45 megapixels, so you can crop in. So really, hopefully this has been of some help. It's not by any means a scientific analysis of the autofocusing system. It's just really just observations. I'm just really just sharing some of the things that I'm doing and just putting it out there. So hopefully it's been of benefit. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, share and subscribe. Thank you very much.